The old man sat on the marble steps of the grand mansion, his tattered clothes hanging off his frail frame. His hair was wild, streaked with gray, and his face bore the marks of a life seemingly spent under harsh conditions. He clutched a cardboard sign that read, "Homeless. Anything helps." Cars slowed down as they passed, some drivers rolling down their windows to sneer or mutter insults, others ignoring him entirely. But the most shocking moment came when a black SUV with tinted windows rolled to a stop. A tall white man in a crisp business suit stepped out. His piercing blue eyes scanned the beggar with disgust. Without hesitation, he stormed up to the old man, pointing a finger in his face. "What are you doing here?" the man demanded. "This isn't some public park. Move along before I call the cops." The beggar looked up slowly, his eyes calm but piercing. "Sir," he said softly, "this is my home." The businessman scoffed and looked over his shoulder. "Yours? This mansion belongs to one of the wealthiest men in the country. You couldn't afford the dirt in the driveway." The beggar slowly stood, his frail body straightening. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek key fob. With the press of a button, the massive iron gates behind him swung open. The businessman's jaw dropped, his face a mixture of shock and disbelief. "Why don't you come inside?" the beggar said, his voice suddenly rich and commanding. "Let's talk about who I really am." The scene froze like a photograph, tension hanging in the air, so thick you could almost taste it. The businessman stood paralyzed, unsure whether to run or comply, while the beggar, no, the owner, waited patiently, his hand extended toward the mansion. 3 days earlier, Joseph Malcolm stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his silk tie. He was everything a man could aspire to be, brilliant, wealthy, and influential. At 45, he had built an empire from the ground up, becoming a self-made billionaire. His mansion was a symbol of his success, a sprawling estate with marble floors, golden chandeliers, and a driveway that could fit a small village. But Joseph wasn't a man to flaunt his wealth aimlessly. He believed in hard work, discipline, and most importantly, the power of humility. Still, he was painfully aware of the whispers that followed him wherever he went. "He doesn't deserve it. How did he get that rich? Lucky break, probably." The skepticism was ever present, and most of it was rooted in one undeniable fact. Joseph was a black man in a world where many believed he didn't belong at the top. Joseph had grown used to the subtle stares and not-so-subtle comments, but deep down, he knew it wasn't enough to ignore them. He had a plan, one that would test everything he had worked for. On that particular morning, Joseph made an unusual call to his assistant. "Cancel my meetings for the next few days," he said. "I'm going undercover." The transformation was striking. Joseph swapped his tailored suits for rags, his polished shoes for worn-out sneakers. He applied makeup to add wrinkles and dirt to his face. By the time he stepped outside his mansion, he was unrecognizable. The first day was uneventful. Passers-by glanced at him, some with pity, others with annoyance. A few neighbors even called security, only to be told by the guards that Joseph had given explicit instructions to let the vagrants stay. It wasn't until the second day that things began to escalate. An elderly woman paused on her morning walk, clutching her small dog tightly. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice trembling. "This is a private neighborhood." Joseph nodded politely. "Just waiting for someone, ma'am." The woman huffed and hurried away, her heels clicking against the pavement. Moments later, a police cruiser pulled up. 2 officers approached Joseph, hands resting on their holsters. "Sir, we've received complaints about a homeless man loitering," one officer said. "You need to leave the premises." Joseph smiled slightly and reached into his pocket. He handed them a business card. "Call this number," he said. "It's my personal attorney." The officers exchanged skeptical glances but made the call. Within minutes, their demeanor changed. They apologized profusely and left, leaving Joseph to continue his peculiar tirade. By the third day, word had spread. Neighbors whispered behind curtains, and social media was abuzz with rumors about the strange beggar who had taken up residence in front of the largest mansion on the block. Some speculated he was a long-lost relative. Others thought he was a squatter testing his luck. That morning, Joseph was met with a different kind of visitor, the businessman in the black SUV. His name was Richard, a prominent real estate mogul who had always harbored a thinly veiled disdain for Joseph. The confrontation was inevitable, and Joseph had been waiting for it. As Richard stood frozen in disbelief, Joseph's heart raced. He knew the moment he revealed his identity, everything would change. But just as the tension reached its peak, a loud crash echoed from behind them. Both men turned to see one of the mansion's massive windows shattered. The sound of the shattered glass reverberated across the estate, cutting through the thick tension like a knife. Joseph and Richard turned toward the mansion, their eyes locking on the broken window. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then, Joseph's calm voice broke the silence. "Looks like we have company," he said, his tone unreadable. Richard's face shifted from shock to suspicion. "What kind of game are you playing?" he asked, his voice sharp. Ignoring the question, Joseph strode toward the front door. His hunched posture from earlier was gone, replaced by the confident stride of a man fully in control. Richard hesitated, then followed, his curiosity overriding his better judgment. Inside the mansion was as magnificent as one would expect. The grand foyer featured a sweeping staircase, crystal chandeliers, and walls adorned with priceless art. But something was off. The air was too still, too quiet. Joseph's sharp eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail. "Stay here," Joseph instructed, heading toward the source of the noise. Richard, despite himself, stayed put. He watched as Joseph disappeared down a hallway, his footsteps echoing on the marble floors. The broken window wasn't just an accident, it was deliberate. And Richard had a sinking feeling that whatever was about to happen next was far bigger than he had anticipated. Moments earlier, a shadowy figure had slipped through the garden, avoiding the security cameras with practiced ease. They moved with precision, their dark clothing blending into the night. The figure stopped by a side window, glancing around before pulling out a small tool. Within seconds, the glass was shattered, and they were inside. Their target wasn't money or jewelry. No, this was personal. Joseph reached the shattered window and found shards of glass scattered across the floor. He crouched down, inspecting the scene. Whoever had broken in knew exactly what they were doing. The window had been one of the few areas not covered by his state-of-the-art security system, a calculated choice. He rose slowly, his mind racing. "Who are you?" he muttered under his breath. As if in answer, a noise echoed from the library down the hall. Joseph moved quickly but silently, his bare feet making no sound on the polished floors. He reached the doorway and peeked inside. A figure stood by his desk, rifling through papers and folders. They wore a black ski mask, but their movements were frantic, as if they were running out of time. Joseph stepped into the room, his voice calm but firm. "Looking for something?" The intruder froze, then turned slowly to face him. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, in a flash, the figure bolted toward the window. "Oh no, you don't," Joseph muttered, lunging forward. He grabbed the intruder's arm, but they twisted free with surprising strength. The two struggled briefly before the figure shoved Joseph backward, sending him crashing into a bookshelf. The intruder dove through the broken window and vanished into the night. Joseph staggered to his feet, his mind racing. He glanced around the room, quickly checking the desk. Whatever the intruder had been looking for, they hadn't found it. But the question remained, why break into his home? Back in the foyer, Richard paced nervously. The opulence of the mansion did little to calm his nerves. The fact that Joseph was clearly more than a simple beggar was unsettling enough. Now, with a break-in on top of everything, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that he was in way over his head. Joseph reappeared, his calm exterior masking the storm brewing inside. "Someone broke in," he said simply. Richard's eyes widened. "And you're just standing there. Shouldn't we call the police?" Joseph shook his head. "No need. Whoever it was is long gone." "Long gone?" Richard echoed incredulously. "You're telling me someone just broke into your mansion, and you're not worried?" Joseph gave a small, knowing smile. "Let's just say I've dealt with worse." Before Richard could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the hall. Joseph's head snapped toward the sound. A man in a security uniform appeared, his face pale. "Sir, we have a situation," the guard said, glancing nervously at Richard. "The perimeter cameras caught someone entering the property, but they disappeared before we could intercept." Joseph nodded. "I'm aware. Double the patrols and make sure all entry points are secure." The guard hesitated. "There's one more thing. They left something behind." Joseph's eyes narrowed. "What is?" Joseph turned the envelope over in his hands, his expression unreadable. Richard, who had been watching in stunned silence, finally found his voice. "What's going on, Malcolm? Who would target you like this?" Joseph met his gaze, his eyes cold and calculating. "Someone who thinks they know my secrets," he said quietly. "But they have no idea what they're dealing with." He broke the seal and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Written in bold, red letters were 4 chilling words. "This isn't over yet." Joseph folded the note and slipped it into his pocket. His mind was already racing, formulating a plan. Whoever was behind this wasn't just after him. They were after something much bigger. "Richard," Joseph said, his tone serious. "You wanted to know who I am? Stick around. You're about to find out." Richard swallowed hard, unsure if he was ready for the answers. But one thing was clear. This was only the beginning. Hours later, as the mansion settled into an uneasy silence, Joseph sat alone in his study. The note lay on the desk in front of him, its message burning into his mind. He knew this was no random attack. It was a calculated move, a warning. He stared out the window in the darkness, his thoughts heavy. Somewhere out there, someone was plotting their next move, and Joseph knew he had to be ready. Suddenly, his phone buzzed, breaking the silence. He picked it up, his eyes narrowing as he read the message. "We need to talk. Midnight. The old warehouse." Joseph clenched his jaw, his determination solidifying. He wasn't going to wait for the next move. It was time to take control. As the clock struck midnight, Joseph slipped out of the mansion, his mind focused and his resolve unshakable. The game was on. The old warehouse stood at the edge of the city, a hulking, rusting monument to a bygone era. Its broken windows and sagging roof made it seem abandoned, but Joseph knew better. This place was alive with secrets, and tonight it would reveal one of its many dark truths. He stepped out of his car, the cool night air brushing against his skin. Dressed once again in his usual sharp attire, Joseph was a far cry from the disheveled beggar of earlier that day. His eyes scanned the area, taking in every shadow and every sound. The warehouse door creaked open as he approached, and a figure emerged from the darkness inside. They were cloaked in a long trench coat, their face obscured by the brim of a wide hat. "You came alone," the figure said, their voice low and gravelly. Joseph nodded. "It's the only way I do business." The figure stepped aside, motioning for him to enter. Joseph hesitated for a brief moment, then walked in. The heavy door slammed shut behind him, echoing through the cavernous space. Inside, the warehouse was dimly lit by a single flickering bulb. Wooden crates were stacked haphazardly along the walls, and the air smelled of dust and mildew. Joseph could feel the tension building with every step he took. The figure led him to a makeshift table in the center of the room. On it lay a collection of old photographs, documents, and what appeared to be a small, intricately carved wooden box. The figure gestured for Joseph to sit. "You know why you're here," the figure said, removing their hat to reveal a face marked by years of hardship. Deep lines etched their skin, and their piercing eyes seemed to see straight through Joseph. "Enlighten me," Joseph replied, his tone calm but firm. The figure leaned forward, their expression grim. "You built an empire, Malcolm, but you made enemies. Powerful ones. They've been watching you, waiting for the right moment to strike." Joseph's eyes flicked to the documents on the table. "And you? Who do you work for?" The figure smirked. "Let's just say I'm not your enemy. But I'm not your friend, either. Consider me a messenger." They opened the wooden box, revealing a small, ornate key. Joseph's eyes narrowed. "What's this?" The figure pushed the box toward him. "It's the first piece of the puzzle. They're not just after your wealth, Malcolm. They're after your legacy. Everything you've worked for, everything you stand for, it's all at stake." Joseph picked up the key, examining its intricate design. It felt heavier than it looked, as if it carried the weight of something far greater than its size suggested. "And what do you expect me to do with this?" he asked, his voice low. The figure's expression darkened. "You'll know when the time comes, but be warned, every step you take from here will bring you closer to the truth, and the truth will change everything." Before Joseph could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed through the warehouse. Both he and the figure froze, their eyes darting toward the source of the noise. The door burst open, and several men in black tactical gear stormed in, their weapons drawn. Joseph immediately recognized the emblem on their uniforms, a private security firm known for its ruthless efficiency. "Mr. Malcolm," the lead operative said, his voice amplified by the warehouse's acoustics. "You're coming with us." Joseph remained seated, his expression calm. Under whose authority? The operative didn't answer. Instead, he signaled to his team, who advanced toward the table. The figure across from Joseph stood, their hand reaching for a concealed weapon. "Don't," Joseph said sharply, his eyes locking onto the figure. "This isn't the time." The figure hesitated, then slowly lowered their hand. The operatives closed in, and within moments, Joseph was being escorted out of the warehouse, his hands restrained behind his back. As they loaded him into an armored vehicle, Joseph's mind raced. He didn't know where they were taking him, but one thing was certain: whoever was behind this wasn't playing games. The vehicle sped through the city, its darkened windows obscuring the outside world. Joseph sat in silence, his mind piecing together the events of the night. The key in his pocket felt like a burning weight, a constant reminder of the unknown forces at play. After what felt like an eternity, the vehicle came to a sudden stop. The doors were thrown open, and Joseph was led into a sleek, high-tech facility. The sterile white walls and harsh fluorescent lighting made the place feel more like a laboratory than a detention center. He was escorted into a large conference room, where a man in a tailored suit was waiting. The man's slicked-back hair and cold, calculating eyes gave him the air of someone who was used to being in control. "Mr. Malcolm," the man said, standing to greet him. "My name is Victor Kane. I represent certain interests." Joseph didn't respond. He simply took a seat, his eyes never leaving Victor's. "I apologized for the dramatic entrance," Victor continued, his tone smooth. "But we needed to speak with you urgently." "And what's so urgent that you had to kidnap me?" Joseph asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Victor chuckled. "Let's just say you've been playing a dangerous game, and you've attracted the attention of some very powerful people." Joseph leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "You're going to have to be more specific." Victor's smile faded. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a stack of files, sliding them across the table. "These are records of every major deal you've made in the last decade. Every contract, every transaction, every partnership. Your enemies have been digging, looking for weaknesses." Joseph glanced at the files but didn't touch them. And Victor leaned in, his eyes narrowing. "And they found something. A connection to a powerful secret, a secret that could destroy everything you built." Joseph's eyes flicked to the key in his pocket. "And what do you want from me?" Victor smiled again, though this time it didn't reach his eyes. "Cooperation. Together we can neutralize the threat. But you need to trust us." Joseph considered the man's words, weighing his options. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford, but for now, he would play along. "Fine," he said finally. "But know this, if you're lying to me, I'll burn this entire operation to the ground." Victor's smile widened. "Understood. Welcome to the game, Mr. Malcolm." As the two men locked eyes, Joseph knew the stakes had never been higher. The game was just beginning, and he was ready to play. The next morning, Joseph awoke in his mansion, still haunted by the events of the night. After hours of tense negotiations with Victor Kane, he had been released, but the weight of their conversation lingered. The key he had received from the figure at the warehouse now rested in a hidden compartment of his desk. It was a constant reminder that his life was teetering on the edge of chaos. He stood by the window, staring out at the sprawling estate. The peaceful morning betrayed the turmoil brewing beneath the surface. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of his phone buzzing on the nightstand. It was a message from his assistant, Olivia. "Olivia. Sir, there's been a security breach. You need to see this." Joseph's jaw tightened. He quickly dressed and made his way to the security room. Olivia was already there, her face pale as she reviewed footage on the monitors. "What's going on?" Joseph asked, his voice calm but commanding. Olivia pointed to the screen. "This footage is from 3 a.m., just after you returned. Watch." Joseph leaned in as the grainy black and white video played. A figure dressed in all black appeared on the screen, moving with precision through the estate's garden. They stopped near a secluded corner, pulling out a device that looked like a scanner. Within seconds, they were inside the perimeter. "Whoever this is, they bypassed our top-of-the-line security system," Olivia said, her voice laced with concern. "They knew exactly where to go." Joseph watched as the intruder made their way to his private study. However, they didn't seem interested in stealing anything. Instead, they placed a small object on the floor beneath his desk before disappearing back into the shadows. "When did they leave?" Joseph asked, his tone sharp. Olivia handed him a sealed evidence bag containing a small, unassuming flash drive. "We found this during a sweep of your study this morning." Joseph took the bag, his mind racing. "Have you plugged it in?" "No," Olivia replied. "We didn't want to risk compromising the system." Joseph nodded, appreciating her caution. "Good. I'll handle this myself." Back in his study, Joseph sat at his desk, the flash drive resting in front of him. He connected it to an isolated laptop, one with no ties to his network. A single file appeared on the screen, play_meum4. He clicked on it, and the screen filled with the face of a man wearing a black mask. The voice was heavily distorted. "Joseph Malcolm," the figure began. "You think your wealth and power make you untouchable, but you're wrong. We know your secrets. We know about the key." Joseph's eyes narrowed. "You've been chosen to carry a burden, a truth that could reshape the world. But with that truth comes danger. Those who seek the key will stop at nothing to claim it. The figure leaned closer to the camera. You've already met one of our agents. They gave you a piece of the puzzle. But be warned, others are coming, and their intentions are far from noble. The video ended abruptly, leaving Joseph staring at a blank screen. He ejected the flash drive, his mind racing. This was bigger than he had anticipated. Whoever these people were, they were playing a dangerous game. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Joseph tried to maintain his usual routine, attending meetings and reviewing business deals, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't shake the feeling that every move he made was being watched. By evening, Joseph decided it was time to confront Victor Kane. If anyone had answers, it was him. He made the call and arranged a meeting at a private location, far from prying eyes. The meeting took place in a sleek underground conference room, lit by dim overhead lights. Victor was already waiting when Joseph arrived, sipping a glass of whiskey. Joseph, Victor greeted him with a smirk. To what do I owe the pleasure? Joseph didn't bother with pleasantries. He placed the flash drive on the table. Care to explain this? Victor picked it up, examining it briefly before setting it down. Ah, I see that made contact. Did you enjoy the show? Joseph's patience was wearing thin. Who are they, Victor? And what do they want with me? Victor leaned back in his chair, his smirk fading. They call themselves the Sentinels. They're a shadow organization that operates outside the law, outside government control. Their mission is to protect the key at all costs. And why am I involved? Joseph pressed. Victor's expression grew serious. Because you're the keeper now, Joseph. The key you hold isn't just a symbol, it's a gateway. It unlocks something ancient, something powerful. And the Sentinels believe you're the only one who can protect it. Joseph leaned forward, his voice low. Protect it from what? Victor's eyes darkened. From those who would use it to reshape the world in their image. Governments, corporations, even rogue factions. Everyone wants the power the key holds, but not everyone understands the cost. Before Joseph could respond, an explosion rocked the building. The lights flickered and alarms blared. Victor sprang to his feet, his face a mask of urgency. They found us, he said. We need to move. Joseph followed Victor as he led him through a series of hidden passages. The sounds of gunfire and shouting echoed through the corridors, growing closer with every second. They reached a secure room, where Victor handed Joseph a small device. Take this. It'll lead you to a safe location. I'll hold them off. Joseph hesitated. And what about you? Victor gave him a grim smile. I'll buy you time. Now go. Reluctantly, Joseph took the device and slipped out through a hidden exit. As he disappeared into the night, the weight of his new reality settled on his shoulders. He was no longer just a wealthy businessman. He was a man caught in a battle far beyond his control. Hours later, Joseph arrived at the safe house, a nondescript cabin deep in the woods. He collapsed into a chair, his mind replaying the events of the day. The stakes were higher than ever, and the enemy was closing in. As he stared at the key in his hand, Joseph knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. The safe house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that pressed against your ears and made every creak of the floorboards sound like thunder. Joseph sat in the dimly lit living room, staring at the key that now seemed to glow faintly under the flickering light. His mind was a whirlwind of questions with no clear answers. Why had the Sentinels chosen him? What was the true purpose of the key? And most pressing of all, how far would his enemies go to get it? Joseph's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of his encrypted phone vibrating on the table. He hesitated for a moment, then picked it up. The caller ID was blank, which could only mean one thing. It was Olivia, using a secure line. Olivia, he answered, his voice steady despite the chaos swirling around him. Sir, are you safe? She asked, her tone filled with concern. For now, Joseph replied. What do you have for me? Olivia wasted no time. We've identified the group that attacked Victor's facility. They're a mercenary unit known as Black Viper. They specialize in high-risk extractions and covert operations. Joseph's grip on the phone tightened. And who hired them? That's the problem, Olivia said. They're ghosts. Whoever's pulling their strings has covered their tracks well. But there's one lead, a name that keeps coming up in our search, Elias Creed. The name sent a chill down Joseph's spine. Elias Creed was a notorious figure in the underground world of black market dealings and covert operations. If Creed was involved, it meant this was far more dangerous than Joseph had anticipated. Find out everything you can about Creed, Joseph ordered, and keep an eye on Victor. If he's still alive, he'll need backup. "Understood," Olivia said. "Be careful, sir. Whoever's after you won't stop until they get what they want." Joseph ended the call and leaned back in his chair, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had faced challenges before, but this was different. This wasn't just about protecting his empire, it was about survival. Hours passed, and the cabin grew darker as night fell. Joseph paced the room, his mind racing with possibilities. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps outside broke the silence. He froze, his instincts kicking in. Moving quickly, he grabbed a weapon from a concealed compartment in the wall and positioned himself near the door. The footsteps grew louder, stopping just outside. Then, a soft knock. "Mr. Malcolm," a familiar voice called out. "It's me." Joseph exhaled in relief and opened the door to reveal the figure from the warehouse. They were still dressed in their trench coat, though their face now bore fresh cuts and bruises. "Come in," Joseph said, stepping aside. The figure entered, their eyes scanning the room. "You're not safe here," they said without preamble. "Black Viper won't stop until they've tracked you down." Joseph nodded. "I figured as much. What do you know about Elias Creed?" The figure's expression darkened. "Creed is more than just a black market dealer. He's a puppet master, pulling strings in the shadows. If he's involved, it means someone powerful is backing him." They reached into their coat and pulled out a map, spreading it on the table. "There's a hidden vault deep in the mountains. It's where the key belongs. If we can get there, we can secure the artifact and buy ourselves some time." Joseph studied the map, his mind racing. "And what happens when we get there? What's inside the vault?" The figure hesitated, their eyes meeting his. "Answers, but also dangers. The vault is protected by ancient mechanisms and traps. Only the keeper can unlock it." Joseph nodded, his resolve firm. "Then we'll leave at first light." The figure glanced out the window, their expression tense. "We might not have that long." As the night wore on, the cabin remained on high alert. Joseph and the figure took turns keeping watch, their senses heightened. Around 3 a.m., the faint hum of a drone broke the silence. "They found us," the figure whispered. Joseph grabbed his weapon, and they both moved to the window. A small black drone hovered outside, its red light scanning the cabin. Without hesitation, Joseph aimed and fired, hitting the drone and sending it crashing to the ground. But the damage was done. Within minutes, the sound of engines roared in the distance. Black Viper was closing in. "Grab the essentials," Joseph said. "We're leaving now." They packed quickly, taking the map, the key, and a few supplies. As they exited the cabin, the night was lit by the headlights of approaching vehicles. Joseph and the figure sprinted into the woods, their breaths heavy as they navigated the dense terrain. Behind them, the mercenaries poured out of their vehicles, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Gunshots rang out, the bullets tearing through the trees. "This way," the figure shouted, leading Joseph toward a hidden path. They ran for what felt like hours, the mercenaries hot on their trail. Just when Joseph thought they had gained some distance, a sharp pain exploded in his shoulder. He stumbled, his hand instinctively going to the wound. The figure turned back, their eyes wide with concern. "You're hit?" "I'm fine," Joseph gritted out. "Keep moving." They pushed forward, the sound of their pursuers growing fainter. Finally, they reached a narrow cave entrance, concealed by thick foliage. Inside, the figure urged. They slipped into the cave, their breaths ragged. The darkness enveloped them, providing temporary refuge. Joseph leaned against the wall, his hand pressed against his bleeding shoulder. The figure lit a small flashlight, their eyes scanning the cave. "We should be safe here for a while." Joseph nodded, his mind already working on their next move. They were far from out of danger, but for now, they had a moment to regroup. As the figure tended to his wound, Joseph couldn't shake the feeling that they were being drawn deeper into a game with stakes far beyond anything he had imagined. And this was just the beginning. The cave's silence was interrupted only by the sound of Joseph's labored breathing and the figure's hurried movements as they treated his wound. The beam from the flashlight danced across the jagged walls, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. "This is going to sting," the figure said, holding a small vial of antiseptic. Joseph gave a slight nod, gritting his teeth as the liquid made contact with the bullet wound. Pain shot through his arm, but he refused to let it show. "Who taught you first aid?" he asked through clenched teeth, trying to distract himself. The figure smirked faintly. "Let's just say I've had my share of run-ins with dangerous people." They finished dressing the wound and sat back on their heels. "It's not perfect, but it'll hold until we can find proper medical supplies." Joseph flexed his fingers, testing the makeshift bandage. "Thanks," he said simply. The figure leaned against the cave wall, their eyes scanning the entrance. "We need to keep moving as soon as you're able. Black Viper won't stop until they've flushed us out." Joseph nodded, though his mind was already elsewhere. "The vault," he said, his voice thoughtful. "What happens if they get to it first?" "They won't," the figure said firmly. "Without the key, they can't unlock it. But even if they could, the vault's defenses would ensure they never make it out alive." Joseph raised an eyebrow. "Defenses?" The figure's expression darkened. "Ancient traps, puzzles, and guardians. The kind of things that don't care how much firepower you have." Joseph leaned back, his thoughts racing. "And you're sure I'm the only one who can unlock it?" The figure nodded. "You're the keeper. The key chose you, and only you can wield it." Joseph let out a slow breath, the weight of his responsibility settling heavily on his shoulders. "Then we can't afford to waste any more time." By dawn, they were on the move again. The forest was dense, the towering trees providing a canopy that filtered the morning light. The air was thick with the scent of moss and damp earth, and every rustle of leaves set Joseph's nerves on edge. They traveled in silence, each step bringing them closer to the mountains where the vault was hidden. Despite the urgency, Joseph couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "Hold up," he whispered, stopping abruptly. The figure turned, their hand instinctively going to their weapon. "What is it?" Joseph scanned the trees, his eyes narrowing. "We're not alone." As if on cue, a low whistle echoed through the forest. The sound was haunting, almost melodic, and it sent a chill down Joseph's spine. The figure's face tightened. "Signal for an ambush. We need to move." But before they could take another step, figures emerged from the shadows, surrounding them. Unlike Black Viper, these men and women were dressed in camouflage, their faces painted with earthy tones. They carried an assortment of weapons, from bows and arrows to machetes, and their eyes were sharp and unyielding. One of them, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, stepped forward. "You're trespassing," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "This is our land." Joseph held up his hands slowly. "We're not here to cause trouble. We're just passing through." The man's eyes flicked to the figure beside Joseph. "You're carrying something valuable. Something that doesn't belong to you." The figure's grip on their weapon tightened. "And how would you know that?" The man smirked. "We've been watching you since you entered the forest. We know what you're after. The vault." Joseph's eyes narrowed. "And what's your interest in it?" The man's smirk faded, replaced by a serious expression. "The vault is sacred. It's not meant to be disturbed." "We're not here to plunder it," Joseph said. "We're trying to protect it." The man studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Prove it." Joseph reached into his pocket and pulled out the key. The man's eyes widened slightly, and a murmur rippled through the group. "The keeper," someone whispered. The man with the scar nodded, a hint of respect in his gaze. "You've come a long way, but the path ahead is dangerous. If you're truly here to protect the vault, we'll help you." Joseph exchanged a wary glance with the figure. "And why should we trust you?" The man's expression hardened. "Because if we wanted you dead, you wouldn't be standing here." The figure nodded reluctantly. "Fair point." The man extended a hand. "I'm Kofi. We'll guide you to the vault, but once we get there, it's up to you." Joseph shook his hand, his mind racing with possibilities. "Let's move." The journey through the mountains was grueling. The terrain was rugged, with steep cliffs and narrow trails that left little room for error. Kofi and his group moved with ease, their knowledge of the land evident in every step. As they climbed higher, the air grew thinner, and the temperature dropped. Joseph's shoulder throbbed with every movement, but he pushed through the pain, driven by a sense of purpose. Finally, after hours of trekking, they reached a clearing. In the center stood a massive stone structure, half buried in the mountainside. The entrance was marked by ancient carvings, their meanings lost to time. "The vault," Kofi said, his voice filled with reverence. Joseph felt a mix of awe and trepidation as he approached. The carvings seemed to pulse with energy, as if recognizing his presence. "This is where it begins," the figure said quietly. Joseph nodded, his hand tightening around the key. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, ready to face whatever lay beyond. But as he inserted the key into the stone door, a low rumble echoed through the mountains. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the air grew thick with tension. Suddenly the door began to open, revealing a dark corridor that seemed to stretch endlessly into the mountain. And from deep within, a guttural roar echoed, sending a chill down everyone's spine. The roar echoed through the mountains like a warning, reverberating in Joseph's chest and making the air feel heavier. The group stood frozen for a moment, the gravity of their situation settling in. "What was that?" Joseph asked, his voice low but steady. Kofi's expression was grim. "The vault's guardian. It knows we're here." Joseph exchanged a glance with the figure beside him. "You didn't mention a guardian." The figure's face was unreadable. "It's more legend than fact. Until now." Kofi stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his mashie. "Once we enter, there's no turning back. If the guardian senses any threat, it will attack." Joseph nodded, gripping the key tightly. "We're not here to harm the vault. Let's hope it knows that." Without another word, Joseph stepped into the dark corridor. The air inside was damp and cool, carrying the faint scent of earth and stone. The walls were lined with more ancient carvings, their intricate patterns glowing faintly as if guiding their path. The group followed closely, their footsteps echoing softly in the confined space. Every sound seemed amplified, the rustle of clothing, the steady breaths, the occasional drip of water from the ceiling. The tension was palpable, each person acutely aware of the unseen danger lurking ahead. After several minutes of walking, the corridor widened into a massive chamber. The ceiling soared high above, supported by towering stone pillars carved with symbols that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and atop it, a large ornate lock that matched the key Joseph held. "This is it," the figure whispered. Joseph approached the pedestal, his heart pounding. As he inserted the key into the lock, the ground trembled slightly, and the symbols on the pillars began to glow brighter. The lock clicked open, and a section of the pedestal slid away, revealing a staircase spiraling downward into the darkness. "Stay sharp," Kofi said, his eyes scanning the chamber. "The guardian won't stay dormant for long." The group descended the staircase cautiously, their senses heightened. The deeper they went, the colder and more oppressive the air became. Finally, they reached the bottom, where another chamber awaited them. This one was smaller but no less impressive. In the center stood a stone altar, and atop it, an ancient artifact, an intricately carved sphere that seemed to hum with energy. Its surface was etched with symbols similar to those on the walls. Joseph approached the altar, his eyes fixed on the artifact. "This is what they're after," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure nodded. "The key unlocks the vault, but the artifact is the true prize. It holds the power to control or destroy." Kofi stepped forward, his expression serious. "Then we must protect it at all costs." Suddenly, the chamber shook violently, and the sound of the guardian's roar filled the air once more. The glow from the symbols intensified, casting eerie shadows across the walls. "Here it comes," one of Kofi's men shouted, drawing his weapon. From the far end of the chamber, a massive creature emerged from the shadows. It was unlike anything Joseph had ever seen, part stone, part flesh, with glowing eyes that burned with an otherworldly light. Its movements were slow but deliberate, each step causing the ground to quake. The guardian let out another deafening roar, its gaze fixed on the group. It raised a massive clawed hand, ready to strike. "Scatter!" Kofi yelled. The group dispersed, each person taking cover behind the pillars. The guardian's first strike smashed into the ground, sending a shockwave through the chamber. Debris flew in all directions, and the air filled with dust and the sound of crumbling stone. Joseph ducked behind a pillar, his mind racing. They couldn't defeat the guardian with brute force, that much was clear. But perhaps there was another way. "The artifact," he shouted. "It's the key to controlling the guardian." The figure, who had taken cover nearby, nodded. "I'll distract it. You get to the artifact." Before Joseph could protest, the figure darted out from behind their pillar, drawing the guardian's attention. They moved with agility, dodging the creature's massive strikes and drawing it away from the altar. Joseph seized the opportunity. He sprinted toward the altar, his eyes locked on the artifact. The guardian roared in frustration, realizing too late what was happening. As Joseph reached the altar, he placed his hands on the artifact. The moment his skin made contact, a surge of energy shot through him, and the symbols on the artifact began to glow brightly. The guardian froze mid-strike, its glowing eyes narrowing. The chamber grew still, the oppressive tension replaced by a strange calm. Joseph felt a connection with the guardian, as if the artifact had bridged the gap between them. "We're not here to harm the vault," he said aloud, his voice steady. "We're here to protect it." The guardian lowered its clawed hand slowly, its gaze softening. The glow in its eyes dimmed slightly, and the creature stepped back, retreating into the shadows from which it had emerged. The chamber fell silent once more, the only sound the group's heavy breathing. Kofi emerged from behind a pillar, his weapon still in hand. What just happened? Joseph released the artifact, his hands trembling slightly. The Guardian responded to the artifact. It recognized our intentions. The figure approached the altar, their expression one of cautious relief. We've passed the first test. Joseph turned to face the group, his resolve stronger than ever. But this isn't over. The real battle lies ahead. As the group began to regroup, a distant sound echoed through the chamber. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. More intruders were coming. The faint sound of footsteps grew louder, echoing ominously through the stone corridors. Joseph and the group snapped to attention, their brief moment of relief replaced by a renewed sense of urgency. "We got company," Kofi muttered, gripping his mashie. Joseph glanced toward the staircase they had descended earlier. The intruders were close, and from the sound of their coordinated movements, they were well trained. He turned to the figure. "How many ways out of here?" "Just one," the figure replied grimly. "The way we came in." Kofi scanned the chamber, his eyes sharp. "We'll need to hold them off long enough for you to secure the artifact." Joseph nodded, his mind racing. He returned his focus to the artifact on the altar. It still pulsed faintly, its surface glowing with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe under his gaze. "Can it be moved?" he asked. The figure hesitated. "It's risky. The artifact is bound to the vault. If we disturb it improperly, it could trigger a fail-safe or worse." "We don't have a choice," Joseph said. "Help me." Together, they examined the artifact closely. The symbols pulsed in a rhythmic pattern, and as Joseph ran his fingers along its surface, he felt a subtle resistance, like the artifact was pushing back. His instincts told him that it wasn't just an object, it was alive in its own way. "I think it's testing you," the figure said. "You'll need to align with its energy to move it safely." Joseph closed his eyes, focusing on the artifact's rhythm. He let its energy guide him, sensing his breathing to its pulse. Slowly, he began to lift the artifact. It was heavier than it looked, and as it rose from the altar, the chamber trembled slightly. The symbols on the walls glowed brighter, and a low hum filled the air. The Guardian, though still hidden in the shadows, let out a soft growl, as if warning them to proceed with caution. "Hurry," Kofi urged. "They're almost here." The artifact lifted free from the altar, its glow intensifying. Joseph cradled it carefully, every movement deliberate. The hum in the air grew louder, and for a moment, the chamber seemed to come alive, the ancient carvings pulsating with energy. The figure grabbed a small satchel from their gear and opened it. "Place it in here. This should stabilize it during transport." Joseph carefully lowered the artifact into the satchel. The moment it settled inside, the glow dimmed slightly and the hum subsided. "Let's move," Joseph said, his voice firm. Kofi nodded. "We'll take the rear. Go now." The group moved quickly back up the spiral staircase, every sense on high alert. The closer they got to the surface, the louder the sound of the intruders became. Joseph's mind raced as he considered their options. They couldn't risk a direct confrontation, not with the artifact in their possession. As they reached the upper chamber, the door to the corridor burst open, and a group of armed mercenaries flooded in. Their weapons were sleek and modern, a stark contrast to the ancient surroundings. "Stop them!" the lead mercenary shouted, raising his rifle. Kofi and his men immediately sprang into action, using the pillars for cover as they engaged the mercenaries. Gunfire erupted, the deafening blasts echoing off the stone walls. Joseph and the figure ducked behind a large stone pillar. "We need another way out," Joseph shouted over the chaos. "There's a hidden passage," the figure said, pointing to a section of the chamber wall. "It's behind that pillar." Joseph glanced toward the wall, his eyes narrowing. "How do we open it?" The figure hesitated. "It requires a specific sequence. The carvings are the key." Joseph nodded, quickly moving toward the wall while the figure covered him. He examined the carvings, his mind racing as he deciphered their meaning. The symbols glowed faintly, and as he traced them with his fingers. Behind him, Kofi and his men moved swiftly, their weapons ready and their eyes scanning for any sign of pursuit. As they navigated the uneven terrain, Kofi slowed his pace, falling in step beside Joseph. "This sanctuary," he said in a low voice. "Are we certain it's real?" "It's real," the figure replied over their shoulder. "I've been there before. The wards protecting it are ancient and powerful. Once inside, even Black Viper won't be able to reach us." Joseph nodded, trusting their judgment. "How much further?" "Not far," the figure said. "But we'll need to move fast. The sanctuary's entrance isn't easy to find, and the mercenaries will be closing in soon." The group pushed on, their path winding through dense undergrowth and over fallen logs. The sound of helicopters grew louder, the searchlights occasionally breaking through the trees, sweeping the forest floor. Each time the group froze, their breaths held until the lights passed. Finally, after what felt like hours, the figures stopped abruptly. They knelt by a massive tree, its roots gnarled and twisted, and began brushing away layers of moss and leaves. Beneath the natural camouflage was a stone archway, its surface carved with intricate symbols similar to those in the vault. "This is it," the figure said, standing and stepping back. Joseph studied the archway, his eyes tracing the carvings. There was an almost tangible energy emanating from it, a subtle vibration in the air. The sanctuary was close. "How do we open it?" Kofi asked, his tone cautious. The figure turned to Joseph. "The key. It's the only way." Joseph nodded, pulling the key from his pocket. He approached the archway, the carvings glowing faintly in response to his presence. He inserted the key into a hidden slot near the center of the arch and turned it slowly. A low hum filled the air, and the symbols on the archway began to glow brightly. The stone surface shimmered, and then, with a soft whooshing sound, the archway dissolved into a swirling vortex of light. "Everyone in," the figure said, motioning for the group to move. One by one, they stepped through the vortex, the light swallowing them whole. Joseph was the last to enter, pausing briefly to glance back at the forest. The sound of helicopters was closer than ever, the mercenaries undoubtedly just minutes away. He stepped through the portal, and the world shifted around him. The sanctuary was breathtaking. They emerged into a vast open space, a hidden world untouched by time. Towering stone pillars adorned with glowing symbols rose from the ground, forming a circular perimeter. In the center of the sanctuary was a crystalline pool, its surface shimmering with an ethereal light. The air was cool and calm, carrying the faint sound of a melodic hum. "We made it," the figure said, their voice filled with quiet reverence. Kofi and his men lowered their weapons slightly, their expressions a mix of awe and relief. "I've heard stories about places like this," Kofi said. "Never thought I'd see one with my own eyes." Joseph looked around, his tension easing slightly. The sanctuary felt alive, as though it were watching and waiting. He walked toward the pool, the artifact in the satchel vibrating softly in his hands. "This place is a safe haven," the figure explained. "The wards here are ancient, designed to repel anyone with hostile intent. As long as we're inside, Black Viper won't be able to follow." Joseph knelt by the pool, peering into its crystalline depths. "And the artifact?" he asked. "Is this where it belongs?" The figure nodded. "The pool is a conduit. It will stabilize the artifact's energy and ensure its power remains dormant." Joseph carefully removed the artifact from the satchel. Its glow intensified as he held it above the pool, the symbols on its surface pulsating in rhythm with the sanctuary's hum. "Place it in the water," the figure instructed. Joseph hesitated for a moment, then lowered the artifact into the pool. The moment it touched the water, the sanctuary seemed to come alive. The symbols on the pillars flared brightly, and the melodic hum grew louder, filling the air with a sense of profound harmony. The artifact sank slowly, its light merging with the pool's glow. As it settled at the bottom, the sanctuary's energy stabilized, and a sense of calm enveloped the group. "It's done," the figure said softly. Joseph exhaled, the weight of the journey finally lifting from his shoulders. But before anyone could celebrate, a loud, piercing sound shattered the tranquility. The sanctuary trembled, and the air grew heavy with tension. The glowing symbols flickered erratically, and the once harmonious hum turned discordant. "What's happening?" Kofi shouted, his eyes wide with alarm. The figure's face was pale. "The wards are being attacked. Someone's trying to force their way in." Joseph's heart sank. "How? I thought this sanctuary was impenetrable." "It should be," the figure said, their voice laced with fear. "Unless—" Before they could finish, a crack appeared in one of the pillars, spreading rapidly. The sanctuary's energy faltered, and the glow of the pool dimmed. "They're using something powerful," the figure said. "Something that's breaking the sanctuary's defenses." Joseph's mind raced. If Black Viper, or worse, Elias Creed had found a way to breach the sanctuary, it meant their time was running out. "We need to fortify the wards," the figure said urgently, "or this sanctuary will fall." Joseph nodded, his resolve hardening. "Tell me what to do." The figure began issuing instructions, guiding Joseph and the others to various points around the sanctuary. As they worked to stabilize the wards, the sanctuary trembled again, the cracks spreading and the discordant hum growing louder. Time was slipping away, and the enemy was closing in. The sanctuary shook violently, its once tranquil atmosphere now a cacophony of discordant hums and cracking stone. Joseph moved quickly, following the figure's instructions as he reached one of the damaged pillars. The symbols etched into its surface flickered erratically, their glow dim and unstable. "We need to reignite the ward," the figure shouted over the noise, their hands busy tracing symbols on another pillar. "Focus on the carvings. Use the key to channel your energy into them." Joseph pulled the key from his pocket. It felt warm, almost as if it were responding to the sanctuary's distress. He pressed it against the pillar's center, his eyes narrowing in concentration. The symbols pulsed faintly, and a low vibration emanated from the stone. "Come on," Joseph muttered, willing the pillar to stabilize. The key's warmth intensified, and the symbols began to glow steadily. The vibration grew stronger, spreading through the pillar and into the ground. Slowly the cracks began to mend, the pillar's surface smoothing as the energy flowed through it. "Good," the figure called out. "Keep going." Across the sanctuary, Kofi and his men worked to reinforce the other pillars. They moved with precision, their actions guided by the figure's shouted instructions. But the cracks continued to spread, and the pressure was mounting. Suddenly, a deafening blast echoed through the sanctuary. One of the pillars near the entrance exploded, sending shards of stone flying. Joseph and the others ducked for cover as the debris rained down. Through the dust and chaos, Joseph saw them, Black Viper. The mercenaries had breached the sanctuary's defenses, their sleek black-clad figures moving with deadly efficiency. They fanned out, their weapons trained on the group. "Take them out," the lead mercenary barked. Gunfire erupted, the sound reverberating off the stone walls. Kofi and his men returned fire, using the pillars for cover as they fought to hold the mercenaries at bay. The sanctuary's sacred peace had been shattered, and the battle for the artifact had begun. Joseph ducked behind a pillar, his heart pounding. The key was still warm in his hand, its energy a constant reminder of the stakes. He glanced toward the pool, where the artifact rested at the bottom. Its light was dim, flickering in time with the sanctuary's failing energy. "We can't let them reach the artifact," the figure shouted, firing their weapon at the advancing mercenaries. Joseph nodded, his mind racing. He knew they couldn't hold out forever. The sanctuary's wards were failing, and the mercenaries were relentless. "We need to buy ourselves time," Joseph said, peering around the pillar. "Can we reactivate the wards?" The figure shook their head. "Not with them inside. The wards are designed to repel threats, but they're useless if the enemy's already here." Joseph clenched his jaw, his eyes narrowing as he formulated a plan. "Then we force them out." He turned to Kofi, who was reloading his weapon. "Kofi, can you draw their attention? Make them think we're retreating?" Kofi nodded grimly. "Consider it done." "Good," Joseph said. "We'll use the distraction to flank them and drive them back toward the entrance." Kofi signaled to his men, and they began a strategic retreat, drawing the mercenaries' fire as they moved. The mercenaries, sensing an opportunity, pressed forward, their focus shifting away from the altar. Joseph and the figure seized the moment, moving swiftly along the sanctuary's perimeter. They flanked the mercenaries, cutting off their advance and forcing them into a bottleneck near the entrance. "Now," Joseph shouted. Kofi and his men opened fire, their coordinated assault catching the mercenaries off guard. The narrow passage left them with little room to maneuver, and one by one, they fell under the group's relentless attack. The lead mercenary, realizing the tide was turning, barked an order. "Fall back. Regroup outside." The remaining mercenaries retreated, their footsteps echoing through the sanctuary as they fled. The moment the last of them disappeared through the archway, the figure rushed to the altar. "Joseph, the key." Joseph sprinted to the altar, the key already in hand. He inserted it into a slot at the base of the pool, turning it slowly. The sanctuary trembled as the wards began to reactivate. The glowing symbols on the pillars flared to life, and the discordant hum shifted to a harmonious resonance. The archway shimmered, its surface sealing as the sanctuary's defenses locked into place. The mercenaries were trapped outside, cut off from their prize. For a moment, the sanctuary was silent, the battle's aftermath hanging heavy in the air. Joseph collapsed onto the altar, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. The key's warmth had subsided, and the artifact's light now pulsed steadily at the bottom of the pool. "We did it," the figure said, their voice filled with both relief and exhaustion. Kofi approached, his weapon slung over his shoulder. "They won't give up," he said grimly. "They'll be back, and they'll bring reinforcements." Joseph nodded, his resolve unshaken. "Then we'll be ready." Outside the sanctuary, the mercenaries regrouped, their leader pacing angrily. "We underestimated them," he growled, "but this isn't over." One of his men approached, holding a communication device. "Sir, we've received new orders. Elias Creed wants us to hold position and wait for his arrival." The leader's eyes narrowed. "Creed's coming here." "Yes, sir. He says he'll handle this personally." The leader smirked, his confidence returning. "Good. Let them think they're safe. Once Creed arrives, we'll tear that sanctuary apart." Inside the sanctuary, Joseph stood by the pool, his gaze fixed on the artifact. He knew the battle was far from over. Elias Creed was a formidable enemy, and his arrival would mark the beginning of a new and even more dangerous phase of their struggle. "We'll need to prepare," the figure said, joining him. "Creed won't stop until he has the artifact." Joseph nodded, his eyes steely with determination. "Then we fight. For the artifact, for the sanctuary, and for the future." The sanctuary hummed softly, its ancient power a beacon of hope amidst the growing storm. The sanctuary's calm was a fragile veil over the tension gripping Joseph and the group. Outside, the mercenaries regrouped, awaiting the arrival of Elias Creed. Inside, Joseph stood near the pool, the faint hum of the artifact grounding his thoughts. They had bought themselves time, but it wasn't enough. Creed was coming, and he would bring more than just firepower. Kofi approached, his expression hard. "We need a plan. Creed's reputation isn't built on empty threats." Joseph nodded, his mind already racing. "What do we know about him?" Kofi exchanged a glance with the figure. "Creed's a strategist," Kofi said. "He doesn't fight unless he's already sure he'll win. And he's known for using unconventional methods, psychological warfare, leveraging hostages, manipulating alliances." Joseph's jaw tightened. "You won't just attack blindly. We'll try to exploit our weaknesses." The figure stepped forward. "The sanctuary's wards are strong, but they're not invincible. If Creed has access to ancient knowledge, he could find a way to breach them, just like his mercenaries did." Joseph's eyes narrowed. "Then we need to strengthen the sanctuary from within." The figure nodded. "There's a way. The sanctuary has an inner sanctum, a core where its power is most concentrated. If we can channel the artifact's energy there, we can amplify the wards and create a barrier Creed won't be able to penetrate." Joseph frowned. "And the risk?" The figure hesitated. "The inner sanctum is deep within the sanctuary, protected by its own set of challenges. Traps, puzzles, and possibly another guardian." Joseph's eyes met Kofi's. "We don't have a choice." Kofi nodded. "Then let's move." The path to the inner sanctum was hidden beneath the pool. Once again, Joseph used the key to activate a hidden mechanism. The water in the pool began to drain, revealing a stone staircase spiraling downward. The group descended into the depths of the sanctuary, the air growing colder with each step. The walls were adorned with more intricate carvings, their glow faint but steady, illuminating their path. After several minutes, they reached a massive stone door, its surface covered in ancient symbols. The figures stepped forward, examining the carvings. "This is the entrance to the inner sanctum," they said. "The door requires a sequence to open. We'll need to solve it quickly." Joseph stepped beside them, studying the symbols. He recognized some of them from his previous encounters with the artifact. As he traced his fingers over the carvings, a pattern began to emerge. "It's a puzzle," he said. "The symbols represent elements: earth, fire, water, air." The figure nodded. "We need to align them in the correct order to unlock the door." Working together, they manipulated the carvings, aligning the symbols according to the sanctuary's ancient logic. The process was tense, each misstep resulting in a low rumble that seemed to warn them of imminent danger. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the symbols locked into place. The stone door groaned, then slowly slid open, revealing a vast chamber bathed in an ethereal light. The inner sanctum was breathtaking. In its center stood a massive stone pedestal, its surface inscribed with glowing symbols that pulsed in rhythm with the sanctuary's energy. Around the room, smaller pillars radiated a soft light, their presence both awe-inspiring and foreboding. "This is it," the figure said, their voice reverent. "The heart of the sanctuary." Joseph approached the central pedestal, the artifact in his hands. "What now?" The figure gestured to the pedestal. "Place the artifact here. It will sync with the sanctuary's core and amplify its power." Joseph carefully set the artifact on the pedestal. The moment it made contact, the entire chamber came alive. The symbols on the walls and pillars flared brightly, and the air thrummed with energy. The sanctuary's hum deepened, becoming a resonant, harmonious sound that seemed to vibrate through their very bones. The figure closed their eyes, focusing on the energy. "It's working. The wards are strengthening. But the moment of triumph was short-lived. A deafening roar echoed through the chamber, and the ground trembled beneath their feet. From the shadows at the far end of the room, a massive figure emerged. It was the sanctuary's second guardian, a towering beast-like entity with glowing eyes and armor-like scales. Its presence was overwhelming, its power unmistakable. "It's testing us," the figure said, their voice tense. "We've disturbed the sanctum. We need to prove our worth." The guardian let out another roar, then charged. Kofi and his men moved swiftly, spreading out to draw the guardian's attention. The creature was fast for its size, its movements fluid and deadly. It swept at them with massive claws, its strength shaking the ground with each impact. Joseph grabbed a nearby staff from the chamber's wall, its surface etched with glowing symbols. He had no idea how to wield it, but instinct told him it was a weapon designed for this exact moment. "Keep it distracted," he shouted, rushing toward the guardian. The figure moved alongside him, their focus unwavering. "We need to hit its core," the glowing symbol on its chest. "It's the source of its power." The guardian turned its attention to Joseph, its glowing eyes locking onto him. It lunged, but Joseph dodged, using the staff to deflect its attack. The impact sent a shockwave through his arms, but he held firm. Kofi's men provided cover, their coordinated strikes drawing the guardian's focus away. Joseph seized the opening, aiming for the symbol on its chest. He thrust the staff forward, the glowing tip connecting with the guardian's core. A blinding light filled the chamber, and the guardian let out a deafening roar. It staggered backward, its movements slowing as the light from its core dimmed. Finally, with a final earth-shaking roar, the guardian collapsed, its massive form dissolving into a shower of light. The chamber fell silent, the only sound the steady hum of the sanctuary's core. Joseph stood over the pedestal, his breath heavy. "It's done." The figure nodded, their expression one of cautious relief. "The sanctum has accepted you. The sanctuary's power is now fully activated." Kofi approached, his weapon still in hand. "Creed's forces won't stand a chance against these defenses." Joseph looked toward the artifact, its light now steady and unwavering. "Let's hope so." But deep down, Joseph knew this was only a temporary victory. Creed was still out there, and he wouldn't stop until he had the artifact. The sanctuary's hum resonated with a renewed strength, its defenses now fully restored. Joseph stood before the artifact, its light steady and powerful, a beacon of hope in their dark struggle. But he knew that the respite would be short-lived. Outside, Elias Creed and his mercenaries were waiting, plotting their next move. Kofi's voice cut through the tension. "We've bought ourselves time, but not much. Creed will find a way to adapt." Joseph turned to face the group. "Then we need to be ready. The sanctuary's defenses are stronger now, but we can't rely on them alone. Creed is smart. He'll exploit any weakness." The figures stepped forward, their expression serious. "The sanctuary can withstand physical attacks, but Creed's power lies in manipulation. He's known for turning people against each other, sowing doubt and discord." Joseph's gaze hardened. "Then we stay united. Creed thrives on fear and division. If we stand together, he won't break us." Kofi nodded, his resolve clear. "Agreed. We'll hold the line, no matter what." The figure moved toward one of the glowing pillars, placing their hand on its surface. "There's another layer of protection we can activate, a mental barrier. It will shield our minds from external influence, but it requires focus and trust." Joseph exchanged a glance with Kofi. "Do it." The figure closed their eyes, their hands still on the pillar. The light from the pillar intensified, spreading to the others in the chamber. The sanctuary's hum shifted, becoming a soothing rhythmic pulse. "Focus on the sound," the figure instructed. "Let it ground you. This barrier will protect us from Creed's psychological tactics." Joseph closed his eyes, allowing the hum to wash over him. The tension in his body eased slightly, replaced by a sense of clarity and calm. He could feel the sanctuary's energy intertwining with his own, a powerful connection that fortified his resolve. Outside, the mercenaries stood in a tense formation, their weapons ready. The lead mercenary paced near the sealed archway, his frustration evident. "When's Creed getting here?" one of the men asked. "Soon," the leader replied. "He'll deal with this personally." As if on cue, the sound of a helicopter echoed through the mountains. The mercenaries looked up as the sleek black chopper descended, its rotors kicking up dust and debris. The helicopter landed smoothly, and moments later, Elias Creed stepped out. Creed was a commanding presence, tall and broad-shouldered, his sharp features framed by a neatly trimmed beard. His dark eyes scanned the area with an unsettling calm, exuding a quiet confidence that demanded respect. The lead mercenary approached, saluting sharply. "Sir, the sanctuary's defenses have been reactivated. We tried everything, but the wards are too strong." Creed's lips curled into a cold smile. "Good, let them think they've won." He strode toward the sealed archway, his hands clasped behind his back. The sanctuary's defenses may be ancient, but they're not infallible. They were designed to protect the artifact, not the people inside. Creed turned to his men. "Prepare the disruptor. We'll force them to lower the wards." The mercenaries moved quickly, assembling a large, complex device. It pulsed with a dark energy, its surface covered in runes that seemed to absorb the light around them. "The disruptor emits a frequency that destabilizes the sanctuary's energy field," Creed explained. "It won't breach the wards, but it will make their power unbearable for anyone inside. They'll have no choice but to lower the defenses." The lead mercenary smirked. "Brilliant." Creed's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Activate it." The disruptor came to life with a low, ominous hum. The runes glowed with a dark light, and the air around it seemed to ripple. Creed watched with satisfaction as the device began its work. Inside the sanctuary, the first signs of trouble appeared almost immediately. The sanctuary's hum grew discordant, and the air grew heavy, pressing down on them like an invisible weight. "What's happening?" Kofi asked, his voice strained. The figure's eyes flew open. "It's a disruptor. Creed's using it to destabilize the sanctuary's energy." Joseph clenched his fists, the pressure in the air making it harder to breathe. "Can we counter it?" The figure shook their head. "Not from inside. The disruptor is designed to force us to shut down the wards. If we lower them, Creed will strike." Joseph's mind raced. "Then we need to destroy it." Kofi stepped forward. "I'll lead a team outside. We'll take out the disruptor." Joseph shook his head. "No. If we send too many, we'll weaken our defense. I'll go." Kofi frowned. "You're the keeper. If something happens to you." Joseph's expression was resolute. "If we don't stop that disruptor, we're all finished. I'll take the figure with me. You stay here and hold the sanctuary." Kofi hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Be careful." Joseph turned to the figure. "Let's go." The two of them moved quickly, exiting through a hidden passage that led to the forest. They circled around to the front of the sanctuary, staying low and using the terrain for cover. From their vantage point, Joseph could see the disruptor. The device was heavily guarded, but its dark energy pulsed ominously, its effect on the sanctuary undeniable. "Do you see a weak point?" Joseph asked. The figure studied the device. "The core. If we hit it with enough force, it'll overload." Joseph nodded. "Then we'll create a distraction. Once we draw their attention, you get to the core." The figure hesitated. "And what about you?" Joseph smirked. "I'll keep them busy." Before the figure could argue, Joseph moved, drawing the mercenaries' fire. The forest erupted into chaos, gunfire ringing out as Joseph used the trees for cover, returning fire when he could. The figures seized the opportunity, darting toward the disruptor. They moved with precision, avoiding detection as they reached the device. They pulled a small explosive from their pack, attaching it to the disruptor's core. Joseph saw the figure's signal from a distance. "Now!" they shouted. The figure detonated the explosive, and the disruptor let out a piercing whine. Its energy field flickered violently before collapsing in a burst of dark light. The mercenaries scrambled, shouting orders as the device fell silent. Joseph and the figure retreated quickly, making their way back to the sanctuary as chaos erupted among the enemy ranks. Inside the sanctuary, the oppressive weight lifted, and the hum returned to its harmonious rhythm. Kofi greeted them as they re-entered. "Good work," he said, his relief evident. Joseph nodded, but his expression remained serious. Creed won't stop. This was just the beginning. As they regrouped around the artifact, Joseph felt a renewed sense of purpose. The battle for the artifact and the future was far from over. But together, they would face whatever came next. The sanctuary pulsed with life, its ancient power a symbol of hope in the face of the storm.